Final day of the MAG meeting. If we could all take our seats, please. Thank you. And just a regular reminder that the meeting is being recorded. There's a transcript, and it's also being webcast to YouTube. There will be a summary report that will come out sometime next week as well. There's the speaking queue, and you can find the link to the speaking queue on the front page. Under the meeting information, I think it is speaking queue. Just click on the tab, and then you'll see it. And I think it will also be posted into the WebEx room for those remote participants who want to intervene. With that, I will pass it over to Lynn to start the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chengetai, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back nice and promptly. I mean, this particular meeting in the MAG meeting schedule is just so critical because we have so much work to do all the time. I think we made great progress yesterday on the workshop selection process, and not only that we managed to get through it quite timely, but I think the process that we actually used this year really did contribute to a really good flow and a set of hopefully kind of somewhat integrated discussions on the three main themes which the community had told us were important. So I think that was a really good process this past year. I would like to ask the working group on eval to think about doing a survey of the MAG members so we understand how the process worked from the MAG perspective. I also think we should think about doing kind of a brief survey maybe to all those that submitted a workshop submission, and then just in general to the community. And I say that because I think we could actually do a targeted one to those that took the time to do the submission by a mailing list, which I assume we could pull together from the Secretariat. If they'll have a particular perspective, those individuals that actually went through the process. And then, of course, there's the larger community process, which is how did they feel and what did they understand about the process overall and what might be improved. And so maybe we can think about what that looks like. I don't actually know how many surveys it is, but I think it would be helpful to kind of do that in fairly near time so we actually capture any suggested improvements and any thoughts on the process overall. The work in front of us today, and I'll turn in a moment to Daniela and to Dennis for any comments as well. The work in front of us today is mainly around advancing the main session planning. So we'll come to that in a moment. I did send a document last night. It was quite late, and thanks to Eleonora for all her support in terms of pulling it together. And I think they're all now posted under the meeting materials on the website as well, or being put there as we speak. We just captured the main items. If there was a specific note, or we could capture a short description from the transcript, that's included. What we'd like to do is to come back to that, plus some of the, there were a couple of kind of meta observations on the process. We'll come back to that shortly. Again, the goal today, and we'll come to the approval of the agenda in a moment, but the goal today is that we identify the main sessions that we think are of interest. If we had our dream wishes, we would actually walk away with some high-level, very drafty titles, a paragraph or two talking about what that main session was going to do, what it would accomplish, our own equivalent of a policy question, or at least policy area, and identify co-facilitators such that the work could continue over the next couple of weeks, and by the end of week 3, June, the MAG would have reviewed, and the Secretariat will have posted the high-level title and a brief program description so that they can post the full program up by the end of June. So I said those are our druthers. Unfortunately, there's not actually a lot of slack in the schedule, because if we don't do it when everybody's still pretty much here, in July and August, things always slow down measurably. And I think we can't wait to kind of pick this up in any substantive manner in September. That's just too it's too late for the community, it's too late for planning, and it's certainly too late to get the level of speakers I think we'd like to pull in. So that pretty much is today's agenda. Again, we said yesterday if there was time, there's one final item on the agenda, which is to look at the multi-year strategic work program and some of the activities there. And if we can get to that today, that would be fantastic. If not, one of the areas is well underway. That's the output and reporting, well underway in the context of, I think, having a high-level idea of what we're trying to do and an ad hoc working group to help advance that. And then the second area, which was sort of options for assessing kind of viewpoints, is one that has been in and out of the MAG for a few years now and was picked up on the MAG list. Jeremy Malcolm, a MAG member, sent a comment a couple of days ago, and we could continue that on the list and possibly bring it into a virtual MAG meeting. So that's what we want to get through today. The next step, of course, is to call for approval of the agenda. I wanted to take a little bit of time and really walk through the agenda items so people knew what our goal is for today. Are there any comments or questions on the agenda or any suggestions for AOB? Just giving it a moment here, but not seeing any. Can I call the agenda approved? Then the agenda is approved. I want to thank everybody, and I will now turn to Dr. Brunstrup. Let's see if there's any comments or reflections, and thank you for being with us here again today. I know this is an incredibly busy period.
Thank you, Lynn. Just want to welcome all of you again, and I'm very happy that after the thunderstorm yesterday, we managed to have sunny weather again, and the weather forecast said that that will stay over the weekend, so I hope that all of you can stay in Berlin and take a little bit of advantage. Looking forward to working with you today.
Thank you. Dennis from Endesa.
Good morning, everyone. No, I can only remind that the draft terms of reference for the MAC chair was posted by the IGF Secretariat. Government stakeholder had a meeting yesterday morning to discuss their views on the MAC chair. So UNDESA is available if another stakeholder would like to contact us with any questions about the MAC renewal or MAC chair appointment.
Thank you, Dennis. So what we're going to do now, I think, is we can pull up, and maybe we can show on the slide here as well, although, again, you have it in your email. It will be posted any minute now. I think it'll show up under the meeting materials. And if we can put it up in the room here, that would be better. The list includes all the suggestions that came up yesterday and a couple of kind of meta observations. One other point that I think might also take a little bit of, well, I hope, kind of pressure off some of the discussion is we could easily, at different points today, break out into a number of small breakout groups, you know, to try and advance some of those and bring them forward if that was a faster process. So I think we should keep that in mind. We had, I think, two kind of meta-level approaches to this discussion yesterday. One is a series of suggestions and topics that we thought would be interesting on the basis of what we saw come in from the workshop submissions and on the basis of what we see happening in the world. Again, we're an advisory group to the Secretary General for the annual meeting program. We obviously do that with community input and community engagement, but there are both those components of our responsibility here as a MAG. There was a suggestion that we start with the narrative that was behind each one of the three themes, look at the program that was proposed and approved for each theme, look at the policy questions that were embedded in that, and bring forward main sessions following that kind of logical flow, if you will. A kind of variant of that was, I think a lot of people said we should probably make sure that we have main sessions that tie to the three themes we put out, and therefore we should probably consider having one that is related to digital inclusion, another to data governance, another to safety, security, stability, and resilience. I think a variation on that was that we probably get there through some of the suggestions. You know, one of them was the digital inclusion in the Global South, for instance, and the need to increase skills and those sorts of things. You know, that could clearly be one that would fit under a digital inclusion label. And then there were another subset, which were issues that were identified from the cost-cutting issues at the thematic working groups. And that was jurisdiction, AI, and Internet of Things. So I think what we can do is if everybody's looking at the list, the first thing is, did we miss anything? So I'll come back to that in a moment. I think there are maybe a couple that are potentially kind of redundant or duplicate or could be combined. We have 7 slots available to us if we recall that there was the one that was called Frontier Issues or something, I think. So, you know, we either have that one reserved for a substantive discussion looking at UN issues, whether that's SDGs, which was a suggestion yesterday, or frontier issues, but or HLPDC was another suggestion for that particular slot. But in total, we have 7 slots across these so far 17 identified. Well, actually, it would be 15 identified sessions because that already assumes 1 for DCs and NRIs. So let me see first. The first question in front of me is there anything missing? And I will go to Ben, and then would just like to open the floor up for kind of any overall reflections, observations, suggestions. Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. So, and appreciate the late work last night to be able to bring us this list today and to kind of take the discussion forward. One question and one comment. I think we can establish that the main sessions will be 2 hours long in principle. I think we also decided yesterday that one main session would be allocated to the DCs and one to the NRIs. So I just wanted to confirm that with those 2 aside, there are still 7 more plus, so there are 10 in total. DCs, NRIs, Frontier, and 9. Okay. Got it. And Chengetai's hiding behind us. Okay, so that's his thinking fists, right. My reflection towards the end of the discussion yesterday, and also seeing the comments online overnight, was that I appreciate a concern to try and avoid duplicating the discussions from the workshops in the main sessions and not to repeat what's already been done. And what I wanted to offer was that I'd see the main sessions as distinct in a few ways, that the workshops are going into detail on very specific issues. Main sessions, by their nature, have to be broader. But also that main sessions provide an opportunity, and by their nature, with the exposure they bring, they provide an opportunity to bring in the high-level speakers that we will talk about needing to get to the IGF. And so there is value to have main sessions on these themes with speakers that won't be there and will be at a more senior level than those people coming to engage in the workshops. So I just wanted to offer my reflections why I think there is value in having some of these main sessions related to the themes, even though there are obviously also workshops related to those themes as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Let me just confirm. It is 9 main sessions in total, 7 against the full list if you exclude the DC and the NRI. 2 hours are available for each one. We're not insisting they be 2 hours. If somebody comes up, if the working group comes up in the main session and says we're fine with 90 minutes or something, or really that's appropriate in terms of what we want to do, that's fine. It's not an obligation for 2, but there is up to 2 hours that we can make available. And yeah, Mamadou did have a good comment online, which is, I think it's important that we all make sure that there is enough distinction between kind of any topping or any of the workshop sessions with the main sessions, which was Ben's last point, that I do think there is a clear distinction to them, but it is something that we need to, to be thoughtful about and pay attention to. Any other kind of general observations or comments or anything that we forgot? And Daniela as well. I mean, sometimes coming to the list from a fresh, from a fresh perspective. Please, everybody, jump in. Then maybe if we just come for a moment to the, sorry, go ahead, Daniela, please.
Yes, unfortunately I missed the end of the discussion yesterday, but I would like to come back to the cross-cutting issues. I mean, the working groups identified AI, jurisdiction, IoT, and I already mentioned yesterday I had the impression that there was another issue, which is human rights, that is cross-cutting as well in a way. So if I take up Ben's point on saying that maybe we shouldn't duplicate the themes, then the main sessions could be the opportunity to address nevertheless in a way the themes in the way that then we are talking about the cross-cutting issues over all three themes. So in my way it would be a good idea to take them on board.
I think that's a good point. By the way, we could post this up in a Google Doc if people thought that was easier to kind of edit on your own or edit later, or for the moment it's probably better that we're all working from the same version of the, of the document, but it's easy enough to do. In fact, that's the way it started. So I don't, maybe the first thing we can do is there were different types of discussions yesterday about how close these main sessions should be to following the 3 thematic working groups, and I think several different suggestions on how we might get there. Jutta had made a suggestion which thought it was important to follow the process that we had started with the call for issues, the narratives, the selected workshops, the policy questions embedded in those selected workshops, and then any other observations from those particular tracks overall, and create a main session following that kind of logic. There was some support in the room for that, and some who I think thought it was that there were possibly other ways to get to the same point of having having main sessions that did reflect the 3 thematic interests. I don't know if we need to kind of take that one off the floor, because that's some of what's embedded in here. I mean, and maybe the question is to you, if we were to have a session on ensuring inclusion in the digital transformation, for instance, and that was a main session. There's 2 questions. One is from the people that were engaged in that track and that work, so that would be Paul Rowney and that group. And the other one is kind of Jutta's comment from a kind of a process standpoint. Does that sort of fulfill the need of having a main session that we can say clearly recalls or integrates with, links with the 3 main themes that we established for this IGF? Or is that a point we need to drill down on a little? I'm just trying to understand whether or not there are any meta process points on, or meta kind of approach to this before we get into, which are the workshops. It's confusing if those points come in later. Jutta?
I was just going through the list of the 17 that you had sent yesterday late, and I'm sorry I didn't have the chance to have a look at it this morning. But I was wondering if we only have 7 available main sessions, because we have 9 and 2 of them are already reserved for NRIs and DCs, whether it would be a good idea to go now through
the the other 15 that are on the list and try whether it somehow fits together, because seeing on the list that there is on the one hand listed as 15 thematic track main sessions, but on the other hand these themes for these main sessions are already among the other 14 somehow. So it's like the list is good to sort it out, but it has some kind of an inner structure, and maybe that could, for example, we have on number 10 cybersecurity, which would be one of the main themes. We have hate speech and content regulation, which is also overlapping, like the SDGs are overlapping with digital inclusion. So maybe it's just like we try to bring the things that are on the list together, and then we will have a discussion how these sessions can be organized.
Thank you, Yuda. I would support that approach. As I said, I pushed on the process a little bit because I know we all think about it differently, we all approach it differently, and I'm trying to make sure that we're okay with the point that was made several times yesterday about needing to make sure that the main sessions clearly link back and reflect the three themes that we heard. And I think, as you just said, they do that if you just scan the top 15 points. But I just wanted to make sure there was nothing that we were leaving hanging. So then I will turn to Sylvia, and before we do that, I would like to ask people then to come in and comment on anything they see in the list that they think could either be consolidated, anything, any kind of general observations in terms of what's there, because I think what we need to do quite quickly is narrow the list down so we can start to have a more substantive discussion on a smaller number of topics. So while everybody's thinking about what they might do to help advance that process, that question, I'll turn to Sylvia. Sylvia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. Good morning, everybody. Silvia Cadena, Technical Community. No, just to let you know that last night, Lucien and I briefly talked about how to merge the first proposal that I presented yesterday and number 14 on that list. And based on the comments from Jeremy Malcolm on the list, on the mailing list, I also contacted Jeremy to see if he's interested to co-facilitate putting together a proposal around the Christchurch call, the Paris call, hate speech, etc. Lots of issues. So we will try to figure out a way, and I guess it would be a good idea just to agree to probably use the template from last year, just to keep it simple, I guess, so that, and I have a deadline of when these main session proposals have to be submitted, so that we can get to work on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. One quick question. The transcript missed the name, and I was asking Chengetai a question. Was it Jeremy Malcolm that you said you'd actually...
Jeremy Malcolm sent a message to the mailing list about the Christchurch call, and you replied. And Lucien is the other person, but he's not here, so hopefully he will say the same.
Maybe I could ask Eleonora, you know, we edited this in a Google Doc. If you can pull up the Google Doc, I mean, I don't think we need to show it just now, but maybe try and capture the state of these discussions. Maybe keep this one there so we have that as a template, and I think one of the suggestions, or maybe even just as a note below it or something, would be that there's a suggestion, an idea, a proposal to sort of merge 1 and 14, or the notions behind 1 and 14. I just want to make sure we kind of keep a kind of current tracking state of the discussion, so whatever you think works best to do that. Paul Rani, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. I'm probably going to repeat much of what's been said, but I think we do have to be very careful that we don't replicate the workshops, and I see some of the session topics look similar to some workshops. So I think a lot of them could quite easily be taken out. I do like the main sessions around the cross-cutting issues that are not necessarily attached to any specific theme. And I'm thinking about the idea of having the main sessions on the thematic tracks and seeing how we could build something So each thematic track could go away and give some thought of what they would feel could be a main session that doesn't compete with the main sessions, but does build on the policy questions. But just being very careful that it doesn't seem as a workshop that's been elevated out of the track. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Some very good observations. Other comments? I mean, I absolutely appreciate it can be hard to understand what we might say around X when it's just 2 to 5 words in the title. But I mean, I think that's the next work, is if we can get to a list that we think, you know, on the surface is interesting on the basis of what we think we could do with those topics, then, you know, the next step is to go away and pull it together. Maybe should we have a discussion then on kind of, there's a cybersecurity, which is 10. There was 9, which was a consolidated session on major policy proposals, which included a lot of the same things: Paris Call, Christchurch, Microsoft cybersecurity, and I'm not even sure what the multidisciplinary internet governance in the private sector, whether that's sort of the same thing as well. But any thoughts and any kind of stream of consciousness from anybody that would actually want to just say, here's some things we could actually think about addressing in that sphere? Susan? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even see in the chat that they were there. So if you don't mind, Susan, I'll go through the chat and then come to you. Sylvia, is that current hand or old hand? It's old hand. Raquel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating some of the discussions yesterday that I missed, but I see on your call for making some sense on the topics, perhaps I can provide a fresh view. So besides merging, for example, the 14 and the 1, I see 9 is also about consolidating the major policy issues, and the way I see it's all about the regulatory approaches that are emerging, and some of them are surfacing in terms of security, like the Paris call calling for some principles, then the Christchurch call calling for some action. You might have also at the domestic level some of the examples and best practices that you can feed and bring from the BPF and so on and so forth. So the 1, the 9, the 10, and the 14 perhaps are part of the same trend of regulation, and it's surfacing in the topic of security. I hope that helps moving.
No, thank you, Raquel. And I do think that is it is helpful, and I think, again, when we start to get to the next level of kind of possible definition, we'll be able to understand if it's 1 or more workshops. Mary Rose, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. While looking at the list, I like the main session, again, on SDG, which I support with other colleagues, but I'm more on merging it with the emerging technologies, as mentioned here in the cross-cutting issues like AI, IoT, and other emerging technologies, and how we can relate it to SDGs. Because number 12 is just SDGs. For me, it's too broad, and I think we have to narrow it down on what we want to talk about SDGs. And also see number 14 and 4, like hate speech. This is from disinformation, content configuration, and I want to relate that to human rights, like the open internet and freedom of expression online. I think those are like the main sessions that I want to combine. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Mary Rose. It's a very, very good observation, and thank you for taking the floor as well. I think that was the first time over the couple of days, and we really want to hear from everybody. Helani, you have the floor, and Helani's online.
Thank you, Chair. Much of what I was going to say has already been said by the previous 3 or 4 speakers. I agree that 1 and 14 are a huge opportunity for merger. 2 and 12, I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity there, the holistic policy framework on ICTs, and maybe combining, I mean, what is the point of policy is to ensure rights and, rights respecting, development enhancing internet experience. Could we tie that with the SDGs at all? Without having seen the proposals, it's a bit hard because policies towards SDGs or something is how I would think about number 12. And if we think about policies for SDGs, then 12 might match. Again, I don't know what this is, what the specifics are. Number 4, human rights, I feel is way too cross-cutting and frankly should be addressed in almost all the thematic main sessions, if there are such, or even the cross-cutting issues, and they will be, because human rights touches upon all the things, whether it's a policy session, whether it's a AI jurisdiction session, and so on and so forth. The other thing is number 9. I think it was already discussed by a MAG member that it also could lead to very well combining with 1 or 14, because that's about the platforms, jurisdiction, and security related calls, or at least combined with one of the other sessions, because or combined with the cybersecurity 9 and 10 seems to be an opportunity for creating a substantive main session, certainly redundant if you have as 2. And my final question is, I haven't seen the NRI proposal. 11 hints at multidisciplinary, I suppose, as opposed to multi-stakeholder. It's I think that could be an interesting session if it's just about multidisciplinary versus multi-stakeholderism, but I'm not sure why private sector is particularly highlighted in a main session, as opposed to broadly discussing the concept and the challenges. And if multi-stakeholderism and private sector participation is coming up through the NRI sessions, because I know a lot of what they struggle with is convincing national level stakeholders about what on earth the multi-stakeholder process is and why it should be promoted and why it's important. We could possibly pick up multi-stakeholderism in the NRI session if that is the way they're heading. Thank you.
No, thank you, Helani. Those are really good comments as well. Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you. I wanted to talk mainly about 1 and 9 and 14, but on proposal 11, I think that might be the shorthand description for what I was talking about yesterday, which was about policy approaches to ensure a multidisciplinary approach to internet governance and to avoid policy making in silos, and that way it looks at the challenges that the high-level panel was seeking to address, and it looks at ideas that have been put forward by the OECD and the International Chamber of Commerce as ways you think around policy making to make sure you bring in groups that aren't otherwise included, and whether that's government departments that wouldn't normally be party to discussions on internet governance, or developing countries, or thinking about policy issues from all the different perspectives rather than only thinking about it in a technical way or only thinking about it in an economic way. So I think the word private sector is maybe misleading there. If number 11 was referring to the proposal I was putting forward. Very much a cross-cutting way that isn't looking at a particular policy issue, but rather at how policy making is done around internet governance and making sure it's done in a multidisciplinary way. So really feeding into the whole reasons for the establishment of the high-level panel. So I just wanted to correct any misunderstandings around that proposal. I know I didn't phrase it particularly eloquently yesterday, and I'm not sure I've done a much better job just now, but it's not about the private sector particularly. do you want to come back on that? Or
I think it probably was that topic, and I think you are actually phrasing it quite eloquently. But if anybody else wants to claim it, then let us know in a minute. Otherwise, I do think that's exactly what that particular topic was, what that number on the list was meant to address. But just if anybody else kind of claims it, then let us know.
Thank you, Lynn. And yes, that in a way that would distinguish it from all of the other main sessions in that it's not looking at a policy issue, it's looking around policy making. And that could be another reason why it might be interesting, because it would set it apart and give us a different kind of discussion. So I know there are lots of proposals here, and people are very helpfully looking at how all of them could be married together. I only really wanted to talk about 1 and 14, and also 9. I think they all go together. And I know you asked me yesterday about the Paris call, and should there be a main session on the Paris call, and I think my reservation was about seeing President Macron's comments last year as suggesting that the IGF has ownership. I'm actually very interested in this idea of is maybe a main session about trust in cyberspace, and that the two particularly prominent examples are the Christchurch call and the Paris call, and we could bring in, whether it's the French government, the New Zealand government particularly, to speak about those, but also recognizing that there are others that weren't involved in developing them, and what are their views, and as a way of finding out how signatories to these calls are implementing and implementing these calls that they've signed up for, whether it's a year on, 9 months on from those calls being announced. So I think there's a way of marrying those all together, having a broader title maybe about trust in cyberspace, which again makes it a cross-cutting issue which picks up various elements of the three themes. As to Helani's, I think it was Helani who just talked about human rights. I think trust in cyberspace goes to issues around freedom of expression, around privacy, but also about how you protect society as well. And so I think that could be really interesting. I just note that in number 9, there's also the inclusion of Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention. I'd see that as different in nature. This was something that Microsoft, a kind of a call for action that we put out 2.5 years ago for a focus on cybersecurity issues at the international level. But it's not a multi-stakeholder call. It's not the Paris call. It's not the Christchurch call. So I would take that out as an example. But I think the Paris call and the Christchurch call provide really great focuses for such a discussion.
I think that's a really good set of comments, Ben, really thoughtful. I'll come back to the queue in a moment, but Mamadou has put a comment in which I think kind of picks up a little bit on what you said as well, so I'll just pull that in. He actually said the context and environment we are living in right now, internet impacting elections, et cetera, and there's a long list of et cetera we could put in, makes him want to call for a main session on geopolitics of internet governance, given the attendance expectations this year, including high-level government reps and parliamentarians. It's kind of an interesting thought, because there's also another school of thought in some parts of the community. This is a lot of what we're seeing today are just the ills of society, and the internet kind of is a different scaling and a different amplification of a lot of those kind of societal pressures. But a lot of people question, why do we need internet governance? Do we not already have processes and systems and rule law, et cetera, that actually could address some of these? And maybe there's something that we can combine between some of what Ben's saying, Mamadou's saying, and that kind of view, which might answer some of the kind of unstated questions about, why do we have internet governance? Why aren't kind of existing institutions and rule on those sorts of things, why aren't they adequate? Is this really something so fundamentally different in terms of its impact that we actually need kind of this focus? And I put it out there because I know there's some people that are actually kind of questioning that, and I think that may be why we don't get kind of the attendance and participation we think we should at some of these processes as well. But going back to one question, I tried to look for the transcript last night and I couldn't find it, which may have just was late. Can we get this transcript like this afternoon from this morning session right away, or can we save it or something so that if we go into breakout groups and people want to kind of capture some of or quickly search, Ben said something really terrific, we can find it? And rather than waiting until the end of the day, that's posted. Okay, thank you, Eleonora. Kenta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Kenta Motsuki, Japanese MAG member from business sector community. I just, like to make a general observation. And actually, I took a look at the B20 Business 20 joint recommendations published by your B20 Tokyo Summit. And under the chapter of digital transformation for all, there are 5 points. So the one is develop policy frameworks to utilize data, so data issues. The second is promote international cooperation in the field of cybersecurity. The third is accelerate digital transformation throughout society. And the fourth is promote AI utilization with trust. And lastly, launch the real-world projects. So that, all these topics are already included in the list. So, for my, personal opinion, the current list is, totally fine for us. And, when it comes to the SDGs, of course, I also support there should be a main session on SDGs. But as Marilo said, SDGs should be everywhere, so that SDGs should be reflected in every main sessions. So, so that I'm not quite sure whether we should have specific SDG main sessions. And lastly, both Japanese government, also the private sector, strongly support to have a number 3 main session, digital governance and digital trade. So as everyone knows, our Prime Minister said data free flow with trust in this year's Davos Forum. So we now sees this digital trade and digital governance is one of the most important issues. So we really want to have this kind of main sessions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenta. Very, very helpful comments. I'm trying to capture kind of what people are saying to see if there's a next iteration on the list that we can start to kind of winnow down. So I really appreciate the specificity. Susan Chalmers, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Susan Chalmers, NTIA. Good morning. So on the meta level question about structuring the main sessions, that is whether main sessions should track the main themes, I think that would be nice, but not necessary. I would agree with Paul that we should be careful not to create main sessions that would be redundant of material in the workshops. To this, so following from that, I think the cross-cutting issues are really interesting. I agree with Mary Rose that if we take cross-cutting issues, it's a way to create a bit of contrast in the program. When we have the 3 tracks, we will have the topping and tailing sessions, and we are finishing that document, by the way, in the topping and tailing sessions. We're working on that right now, but I think that could create contrast if we have some different topics in the main sessions. In terms of focusing main sessions on specific initiatives, like the Paris call or the Christchurch call, just these very specific initiatives, I think that could have an exclusionary effect, as Ben had mentioned, to those parties that did not participate or who are not signatories to the call. So I would caution against naming or focusing specific main sessions on those specific initiatives, but of course, these initiatives can be spoken to under a more cross-cutting session that could be more inclusive. Thank you.
No, thank you, Susan. And just to clarify, I know when Ben said earlier that he suggested that I was suggesting the Paris call be a main session, my comment was actually meant to be more broad with respect to what does this room think we ought to do with respect to responding to the Paris call, because it was the President of France standing up in front of the IGF suggesting some very concrete things. And my comment was that as a courtesy, we should at least have considered what he asked us to do and figure out what the right thing for us to do is and respond. And I still think that's something we should do quite consciously. Whatever it is we do or don't do, right? If we say it's not appropriate, it was an inappropriate request, or the topic isn't, or it's too, but I don't think we should just leave it there kind of fallow, if you will. So that was my comment. It wasn't to force it into a main session or anything, but that the MAG take a conscious decision with respect to what a response should be to a very specific request that was given to us. Susan?
Just not coming back on that, but I forgot one more point I wanted to add. I see a lot of session topics that deal with content and the different problems that are related to content. It might be useful to consider consolidating those into a content governance discussion, because that could be a better way to capture some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, good point. Let's see, Rudolf. Rudolf, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. Rudolf Griedel, Germany. I wanted to say similar things as Susan said on these specific initiatives like the Christchurch call, the Paris call, and so forth, the Microsoft proposal. I think these are too specific and too narrow to cover a main session. It's not. A main session should, in my view, be a place where themes or developments are being discussed that have a little broader scope and go a little beyond today's preoccupations. So it would be perhaps a good idea to have something like this idea to have an overview of what's going on in the internet governance world with calls and UNESCO and Council of Europe and all these different initiatives and make some kind of mapping or do some kind of mapping and seeing what's going on. How can the IGF feed into these developments, something like that, but rather broader than to focus it on one specific initiative. That's one comment. And another comment would be I want to make again the case for our proposal on the digital governance and the digital trade, and perhaps you could even merge it or see it also under the angle of jurisdiction, because there are so many initiatives and actions going on at the moment in the digital policy making around the world that affect trade and somehow the free flow of data and the free flow of not even data but even equipment, IT equipment. So I think that is something we could rephrase it or broaden it, but I think that's really an issue that should be covered by the IGF because it is something that is dear to so many of us, and it is something that the public would probably not understand if the IGF would not in some way discuss these issues. One last point. I do not yet get exactly what the proposal SDGs should look like, because the SDGs, there are I think 20 of them, and so what perhaps somebody who proposed it could explain a little bit more in detail what this session should really bring as input and output, because I think just to say the SDGs are important, that's perhaps not enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudolf. I think those are both really important points. And in fact, I remind everybody we actually have a dynamic coalition on trade as well. And certainly there was a lot of activity in the IGF a couple of years ago, and a main session on trade too. With respect to your last point, maybe the speakers that are in the queue can just kind of quickly reflect on this as well. But the SDG, a number of people mentioned it in the context of SDGs should be assessed, included, evaluated in the context of these other discussions. And so far today, there's been like 3 comments on SDGs, and they've all suggested, I think, if I captured it correctly, that there not be a separate SDG main session, but that the SDGs be incorporated in and discussed as a part of these other topics where there's a relevant fit. So, you know, as I work towards the shorter list, I'm taking the SDGs off as a separate workshop on the basis of the conversation so far, with the notion that it would be incorporated in the others. So if somebody wants to speak you know, against that or argue for a separate session, then please do so in the next round of interventions. And again, just trying to say what I'm taking away from the conversations I'm hearing to get to the next round on the list. Let's see, Carlos. Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you. Carlos Afonso. I, of course, echo the perceptions that we need to specify more the themes of several of the main sessions. And I would recall that in the intersessionals, there are the dynamic coalitions, which is more than a dozen, I think 20 or more coalitions. And we have, of course, the NRI process, and both are contemplated as with a main session. And the best practice forums are not. I think that the best practice forums could be prepared to provide at least a report for debate in a main session in November, because they are intersessional and they could prepare that. So I want to suggest that we include a main session for the BPFs as well.
So I should just ask Chengetai to say what he's just saying, but I mean, in brief, just so that everybody has the same kind of profile of the picture. The BPFs have their individual sessions as part of a workshop slot, and there will be a report out on the appropriate BPF activities in the Friday taking stock as a part of here's what the IGF is advancing and moving forward. So there is some coverage there. That doesn't take away from Carlos's point that I think he was suggesting that there should be a main session focused on them. I think my perspective on that would be, just as we always say, we want to integrate the appropriate pieces of intersessional work in all the activities of the IGF. You know, for instance, if there was something on cybersecurity or looking at some of these different kind of challenges or proposals, that we would integrate the BPF's activities and work and views in those sessions as well. Jutta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn, for giving me the floor. I do think that the main sessions should somehow justify, or the issues for the main sessions should somehow justify themselves, not only by the format that we have 2 hours and that we have the translation, but also by the character of the session, and that means by the themes that are addressed in the session. And considering that, when I look at the list, for example, 14, hate speech, disinformation, we have under the security and safety track now, I do think 3 workshops. After the merger, we will have 3 workshops addressing misinformation, and we will have 3 workshops also after merger addressing fake news, hate speech, and freedom of expression. So these issues will already be within the safety and security track, and if it's should be justified to draw that also to a main session, then it needs more of an overarching character of the theme. It could not be just reduplication, and so I do think the decision that we make on main session topics should also be seen in relation. And I know yesterday I've pledged for having these main sessions in relation to the three thematic themes, but it could not just be that we take one issue out of the track and say, okay, this issue goes, or this topic goes to the main sessions. And if I look also on the list number 4, which is human rights, of course human rights is related to other things that are listed there as well. Human rights can be infringed by artificial intelligence. Human rights can be infringed by Internet of Things. So I would not like to see a main session that has these different aspects of human rights addressed in different main sessions. They should be drawn together. We had yesterday also identified from the workshops list the issue of children's rights and privacy. That was identified as a cross-cutting issue. I don't see that now on the list of the 17 as a separate cross-cutting issue, but for me it's the same like the other things. It could go into the human rights main session, but then also like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things should be treated the same way. Have a look whether they are linked to more overarching topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta, again for a very comprehensive set of comments. Dennis has asked to come in on the SDGs, and we'll continue with the queue in just a moment. Dennis?
Thank you, Lynn. So there are, as you know, 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they all have 169 targets, and these targets are monitored by 232 indicators. And out of those 232 indicators, 6 or 7 of them are ICT related. So for the SDGs session, I just want to bring to your attention that the last WSIS forum, the entire forum was for SDGs, and there were a lot of discussion happened there. The most recent STI forum that also had science and technology innovation for SDGs, that was the main theme. So I think when we bring SDGs to the IGF, we should think how we can complement other fora and not replicate, and what would be the unique entry point from our side. And also, one last point is about the artificial intelligence AI for Good Summit, which is organized by ITU. That also had the main theme for SDGs. So there is this kind of different discussion going on, and it's all same. So I think we should try to find a niche for us. Thank you.
I think that's a very important point, Dennis. It's a very, very important point. It's a huge, a huge undertaking. Maria Pascanales, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Maria Pascanales, representing Civil Society. I have a couple of points. Some of them are converging with some of the things that have been raised before, but regarding the first session topic, the proposal that was presented by Silvia yesterday, I think that there is a slight different angle in which this proposal can be seen. I agree with what Ben and Susan have raised before regarding that it could be risky, like to focus main session in specific initiatives. But I think that the reality is that the topic that Silvia was proposing, it's more than looking to a specific initiative. That is way in which maybe because we are trying a shortcut, we are naming it. what this proposal looks is to a specific problem inside a broader context. I think that Susan's idea of like making a content governance session, it's a very good one, but I think that this particular proposal comes to a specific issue inside that broader topic that also could be covered by a main session, try to address, and that is not exclusive from the Christchurch call. And it was previously identified by in other situations that happen around the world, and the policymakers, either in the private or public side, have failed to find a more definitive solution or a solution or a set of tools that allows to avoid that this problem keep coming and people feel frustrated because there's not a set of tools to kind of tackle these problems. So I think that maybe like a good compromise solution to rescue this value of this proposal that is conceding a lot of interest by many actors is rephrase it as dealing with content in emergency situation and invite to be part of this other initiatives that in other moments have dealt with this, and this specifically including, for example, many situations that happen in the global south in which this is very common, and not only focusing in the initiative that until now have been coordinated and led mostly by global north decision makers, but also like making more inclusive, acknowledging that this is a relevant problem that we keep seeing, and there is an urgent from the general public to try to move forward in finding a set of tools for tackling it. So that's the first thing. For the second one, I would like to have more clarification about what we are talking about when we are saying holistic policy framework on ICT, because for me, like, that's everything that it's covered by the other sessions also. So I think that when we pose like such a broader topic, we risk to get lost in the confusion. From the 3 to the 8 proposal, I consider that are interesting cross-cutting topic that should be considered in the agenda. In particular, regarding to the human rights main session, I think that we should bear in mind to make like the most cross-cutting possible this session, as Jutta was like mentioning before, because I am consistently seeing a kind of approach that isolate the topic of human rights from the others. And human rights should be like all around this different session because it's a fundamental angle that need to be covered, either if we're talking about digital trade or cybersecurity or anything. So just be sure that when we are like devoting a specific time for a main session on human rights, make it really comprehensive of other topics that will be discussed in other sessions. And finally, I mentioned it already a bit, but just reinforce the idea that I think that the 14 proposal that was now tagged as hate speech, disinformation, and so, I think that it will be good to rephrase it, as Susan proposed, as content governance session, and in that session to provide like more space to talk about other kind of issues that are not related with the emergency situation. So those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Very, very good comments. One of the things I'm taking away from some of the discussion, in fact, from yesterday as well, was we put in the topic for item 1, the topic that was in the email that went out yesterday, but I mean, in fact, it could be anything from internet platforms and timely, well-informed, rights-respecting regulation, addressing how do we actually participate in a timely manner in some of these. So I think, I don't, from my perspective, what I think Sylvia was describing yesterday was it was less a focus on the Christchurch call and more about how we actually do timely, rights-respecting regulation in a world where there's a lot of pressure to move quickly, and that has, in recent times meant that it's been relatively kind of closed government or regulatory process. So maybe there's a way to combine some of those notions and make it a little less about one topic, since there's been a number of comments that kind of commented on that. Or it's internet platforms and the challenges of online content moderation in a multi-stakeholder participation to support, quick action or something like that. If in fact my earlier restatement was going further than what the group was intending. Just throwing that out there for a different perspective. And then agree on the human rights. And everybody says you need to design security, and I also think we should be designing human rights into all of our discussion and a lot more attention to rights respecting in everything we do, not if you're interested in human rights, you go to a human rights session. So I think there's arguments to be made for both calling it out separately and really focusing on it and really getting everybody to just embed rights respecting in everything we do. And I think there's kind of both kind of threads are important. So we'll see where the group gets to later on that. Raquel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lena, for giving me the floor again. I would like perhaps to follow up on some of the comments that Ben started, you, Susan, and others on this big picture. I'm going to take three of the topics, right? This main session on the actions, the call for actions on the trust agenda, the jurisdiction one, which is, I think, the 7, and the SDGs comment connecting with the CNB work that has been done in the past. But on the major main session, taking the big picture that we started with the IGF France with the theme of the Internet of Trust, I think it makes sense to look what has happened in this regard, including the calls, so not a main session focused on the calls per se, the Paris call or the Christchurch call, or others that might come to November, right? So Kenta rightly remind us that there is G7, there is G20, there are other policy-making decisions in the way to November. So this main session perhaps could look into those approaches that are related to trust, from Paris to German, right, to Berlin, and build into this cohesive narrative. I think it could be a way to look into the agenda, and it makes sense also as we are looking to streamline and make us more cohesive, also between one and the other, what is building and how the IGF is really addressing those. Regarding the jurisdiction, the cross-cutting issue on jurisdiction, and I think Susan mentioned the internet governance and the ecosystem, and I think it's also a matter of understanding the internet model, and it could be playing with the theme of this year, IGF, jurisdiction and the global internet, or I'm trying to avoid our fellows I can, but the jurisdiction and one internet. To understand also these complexities when we are talking about this global network of networks and a jurisdiction that brings a very territorial approach. And last, on the SDGs, we've been working with the CNB, the major intersectional policy track, and one of the successes that it brought was when we broke down year by year into some of the topics, because it allows people to understand and to bring their experiences and their best practices on how the internet and all the digital transformation can bring the change and achievement of the SDGs. So I would suggest not only that it is focused by topic that we can capture, and perhaps that's an exercise that we can do with the tailing or the outputs group. I think it's really important to dialogue with the broader UN discussion, and again, bringing the IGF to be relevant into those discussions and what we are really capable of doing. I also, during the conversations, I don't know if we dropped one of the comments Timea made, I think, in one of the calls from the MAG. Each main session, when we were talking about human rights being cross-cutting, to have to tackle the economic, the social, and the technical aspects in each of them. I think this is important, and this brings us back on how also we streamline. So I hope I'm being helpful in moving this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Again, I really appreciate everybody's, substantive and fairly specific comments too. I think it's helping us to narrow the discussion down. So very appreciative. Didi, you have the floor.
Thanks, Lynn, for giving me the floor. This is Didi Cassa, a government stakeholder group. So I actually think it's important for the main session try to avoid duplication with the other session. And I'm quite agree with what have been said by Ben, Rudolf, Susan, and also Raquel about the session related to the cybersecurity and trust. I think we should have a main session and having the Paris School and also the Christchurch Callas two examples, also explaining what has been reached in this last year and so forth. So about number 2, holistic policy framework on ICT, and number 11. So I think I agree with the comment that has been raised before, that maybe multidisciplinary internet governance should be left as it is and not related to the private sector. Maybe I don't understand why private sector and not maybe technical community or other things. And maybe I think we should be more explicit in specifying what is included in number 11, because there could be some community, because also number 2 is addressing the importance of multidisciplinary internet governance discussion and how to improve coordination between actors. So maybe there could be some community between 2 and 11. So about number 3, digital governance and digital trade, I think it could be added also something like a jurisdiction, because jurisdiction is important. I mean, digital trade is very important. So, and I also think that cross-cutting issues could be merged. I mean, the one on artificial intelligence and on IoT. So, and about SDG, I think it's important to have a session on SDG, but at the same time, I think it's important to be more specific, to understand what we are going to discuss, because SDG, I know that there has been a session on the last ITU convention on I for Good, but I think we should be a little bit more specific on what we want to handle. And then I also agree that human rights is something that involves more main session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Didi. Again, very useful comments. Maybe I could ask whoever suggested the holistic policy framework on ICTs, number 2, if you're not already in the queue, to come back in the queue and talk about that a little bit more, because the notes that we'd captured say that it's to address the importance of multidisciplinary internet governance discussions and how to improve coordination between networks. And I think when Ben gave some additional background to number 11, saying that it really was more about policy approaches to ensure multidisciplinary approach to internet governance is a better phrasing for that. And I do agree that there seems to be a lot of commonality, but I'm also worried that we may have missed something else that was captured in a holistic policy framework on ICT. So whoever brought that up, if they can speak to it, that would help advance us here. Tamea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. I have a couple of comments on a number of these session proposals, but to start from what you just asked about the holistic policy framework and the multidisciplinary IG, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that those two are basically the same proposal. If I remember well what Ben said yesterday, I think it was about making sure that we take a holistic policy framework and we discuss this of how really we build the different policy elements around any issue in internet governance. How do we ensure that that is inclusive of all stakeholders and of all disciplines? And I think the idea was to also make a link to the call from the Secretary General on the high-level panel on digital cooperation to be open to all disciplines and to foster dialogues around policy issues with all stakeholders and all those who are concerned. So I think those two proposals are basically the same. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But looking at a couple of my colleagues in the room, I think that is the case. So I would propose that we look at those two as one. And following from there and building on what Helani has said before, I think we can go further with the holistic policy framework and add the SDG angle into that. In my mind, we are looking at, I know there's only 6 indicators that mention ICTs directly, but I think all indicators and all SDGs should consider ICTs as a tool to further those globally agreed goals. And I think if we look at why are we constructing holistic policies around digital technologies, we're doing that with a reason, and that reason is, all states have agreed that years back, that there should be the sustainable development goals. So I see that constructing a holistic policy framework to enable digital technologies towards the sustainable development goals as a theme for a session. On some of the other ones, I just wanted to support colleagues who were suggesting some sort of a merger between session proposals 14 and 1. I think I really like the idea of the way, I think, Ben, you put it, trust in cyberspace, and to include a couple of other elements in there. These are very, very hot topics right now. I think it's very impressive that both states and private actors are calling for cooperation on these very important issues, but calls come out and go. Until November, we might even have, hopefully positive calls, but we don't know what happens. I think we need to be sure that whatever session we put forward gives a more broader view on these issues and tries to move the discussion forward around really forging a safe cyberspace where people can interact without any issues infringing on their rights, on their privacy, or they can trade safely. They can make sure that their data is secure and that the content they receive online is legitimate. So I would propose again a merger around those sessions. And if we do that, I think the human rights angle should be, as you said, all-inclusive around all those. And I see themes for as Titi said, for emerging technologies coming out, like AI, IoT, and any others. I wonder if those could be either included under the holistic policy framework for SDGs and have a specific, not all technologies, but maybe have a specific angle on that, on emerging tech for SDGs, and encouraging a 360 policy view around that. So I'm just wondering if those could be picked up that way and to streamline this list into really impactful sessions. Another point that I'm not sure if we underlined yesterday or not, I hadn't had time to look through all the transcripts, but considering the sessions from the national and regional IGFs and the dynamic coalitions, I recall Jutta saying that it was a good exercise last year, that the MAG and the dynamic coalitions collaborated on topics. I would love to see what are the topics that these communities are interested in, to see if they align with what we had or they're completely different. But I think in either case it would be a useful exercise to repeat what we had last year and work together on those sessions. I'm not saying that we need to take over. I just want to be sure that those themes that they bring out complement what we have here, and I'm happy to, as we worked together last year on dynamic coalitions, I'm happy to do that again with any of the constituencies. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, I think two-way complementarity is really, really good, and I think we all want, good integration between all the elements. So I think we can do that in the next step, and we get down to a closer list here. Thank you for all your comments, Tamaya. But I'm going to keep going through the list, and then I'm going to try to see if I can capture where I think we are on the second round of list, unless there's somebody else who would prefer to do that. That would be helpful too. And what we'll do is then try to put a couple of lines under each one of them. If we could get to kind of a potential draft of these workshops, a draft list before lunch, that would give us some time to kind of kick some of the ideas around at lunch and then come back after lunch and advance them as well. So I think that would be a good goal to shoot for. Ben?
I just wanted to, your question before Timea, I just wanted to clarify that having looked at the list, number 2 seems much closer to what I actually talked about yesterday. So maybe number 11 was somebody else. I don't know if someone needs to step forward and own that before it gets disregarded, but yeah, I think I was too quick to jump in to Helani's comment around number 11 and associate it with what I was talking about, and now I see number 2. I think that's more what I was driving at. Thank you.
I think there have been a number of comments since one of the notes I've made here that 2 and 11 are close enough that we should, if it makes the short list, combine them and explore that as an idea. Afi, you have the floor.
Hello everyone, thank you for giving me the floor. Please, my concern is with session 6 and 8. Please, can you merge the two of them?
So sessions 6 and 8, the transcript didn't capture. The question is sessions 6 and 8, cross-cutting AI and IoT. What is the question or the comment?
Please, can you merge both of them?
So merging both
to make
of them.
one session.
Right. No, and there was a similar comment as well. I think TD made it the same one. So I think that's a note here as well. Thank you. And we'll pick that up when we go to the next iteration. Paul Charlton, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Lynn, and good morning to everyone. Just a few comments on coming this far down the speaking list. There's always a risk of repeating some things that other people have said. I would, as one of the people who yesterday supported the idea of a main session on the SDGs, I certainly I agree with the comment that was made earlier on this morning that the SDGs itself is far too broad a topic, so it needs to be specified. It seems to me in this context that perhaps combining 12 and 13, so having the SDGs and talking specifically about inclusion in the digital transformation is kind of a natural combination. It feeds into one of our main themes as well. Also on the topic of content, I think it was Susan who proposed putting the, I think it was 1 and 14 and maybe others that dealt with content into one session, and that makes sense to me as well. And finally, on the topic of session 9, I think it was Ben who suggested framing this instead of consolidated session on major policy proposals. He suggested framing it in terms of trust. I think that was the case, so Ben can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that would provide a good framing, and it would also respond to the discussion we had in April when we talked about that in addressing issues and addressing proposals or developments like the Paris call. The focus wouldn't be on the initiative itself, but on sort of elements, common elements, or the substance of what these various initiatives are trying to do. And I think therefore that makes the session more inclusive. It covers the wide range of initiatives that have happened and are happening. And yet to the extent that the Paris call would be one of the many initiatives that session would cover, it also demonstrates that we haven't ignored President Macron's proposal or suggestion to us from last year to consider the Paris call. And I think handling it this way is a way that's appropriate for the IGF and appropriate for the context, since many other developments have happened since then. So we would have one session with a common theme that talks about many different initiatives and what exactly they're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Mary Uduma, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. And at the risk of repeating what others have said, I want to support what has been said. For me, I'm not going to make long speeches. I'm just going to say some of how I relate the different sessions. I looked at trust, and I'm relating 1, 9, 10, and 14 on that trust, because they are all the calls that we have been making. And 2 and 11, I relate them. Number 2 and number 11. I relate them, and I think that was what I was raising concerning the call by the UN Secretary General in the last meeting. 3 plus 13 plus, 3 plus 7 plus 13, because it has got to do with digital. And why I'm saying this is that we are moving from internet governance to digital governance. And if we are to move with the times, I think we should be looking at 3, 7, and 13 together. Then I believe that 6, 7, 6 and 8, I will relate it with 12. 6, 8, I relate it with 12. And I agree with the last speaker that we also add 13 to that. And I would also like us to see whether we have covered all the baskets, the usual baskets that we have in the internet governance, like the trust, privacy and openness, safety, data governance, and so any topic we are taking, we should also look at it. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Also very comprehensive. Did you want to come in, Daniela?
Maybe after the list.
Paul Rowney, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering and thinking aloud, but do we need to have 9 main sessions? Are we just trying to fill them because they are there on the schedule? They compete against the workshops, the dynamic coalitions, the open forums. It's fragmenting where people are in the IGF. And a thought is, why don't we reduce the number of main sessions and maybe have 4, 1 per day, which could possibly be a 3-hour thing, and try and consolidate some of these issues. So there isn't just one track of main sessions that go through the 4 days, pulling people away. When you look at the workshops, this is my thought of what we really want people to engage in. And we're now working to pull them away from those sessions. Thank you.
No, I think that's a good point, Paul, and one that came up yesterday. And of course, the answer is no. We don't need to fill every hour with a main session slot. I think the real test is, do we think this is adding something significant to the discussion at the IGF? And I think that ought to be the overall factor with respect to whether or not we move, 1, 4, or 7 of these forward. And I think we ought to apply a really kind of critical lens and say, is this adding something beyond all the other sessions that are at the IGF? So maybe we can come to that in just a moment when we see where I've been in the queue, and then I'm going to ask Daniela and Chengetai if they have any additional comments as well. So Ben, you have the floor.
Actually, that was an old hand, so sorry about that.
Excellent. And Daniela?
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, I wanted to come back to one point that was raised earlier, the possibility of merging the cross-cutting issue AI with the cross-cutting issue IoT. I would advocate against that because in my view that are two different things. AI is about deep learning, about data, big data, governance of data, and in my view IoT, that's the interconnection of basically everything. And in my view there is more focus point on security issues rather than on data issues. Of course, that has also to do with data because IoT and connected things are collecting data, but nevertheless, in my view, that are two different issues, and I would advocate to keep them separate. Having said that, and taking up Paul's point, do we really need 9 main sessions? Or 7 if we agree on having NII and DCs. I have a suggestion for a set of 6 instead of 7. I tried to gather a little bit your comments on merging themes, and I have a suggestion now. Coming back to Paul, who said we should have one session on policy making instead of a specific policy field, I think that's a good idea. So one session could be policy making in the digital world, different approaches to internet governance, and then that could be merged with the idea from Paris call to a Berlin call, including Christchurch call. That would then, in my view, merge the numbers 2, 7, 9 and 11. A second group will be human rights respect in a world of even quicker action. That's, I think, the idea that was behind the Christchurch call suggestion, so that would merge 1, 4 and 14. Then I would come back to our own proposal of digital governance and digital trade as a third point. A fourth would be AI, and then, as I just mentioned, I see there a reference to one of our 3 themes, namely the data governance theme, so I would focus AI changes and challenges to data governance. The next one would be IoT, and there I have another reference that on cybersecurity, that could be IoT interconnection of everything, how to guarantee security and safety and resilience. And then there's the third theme, and I also see there the point that was just made to interconnect 12 and 13. So that could be SDGs, ensuring inclusion in the digital transformation. That could be focused even further, I think, but in fact that would merge 2 and 13. I forgot to mention IoT. In the IoT theme, that would be merged 8 and 10. So if I counted correctly, we have basically gathered all of the themes that are on the list. So that would just be a suggestion for regrouping. Thanks.
So I think I just captured 5 of those, and let me try and go through them again. One is kind of human rights respecting in a world that's demanding quick action, something like that, and that was 1, 4, and 14.
1, 4, and 14, yeah.
Right. The second one was policy making in a digital world with 2, 7, 9, and 10.
11.
Yep, sorry, 2, 7, 9, and 11. Let me look at my notes more closely. And then 3 was the digital governance and digital trade, which was number 3 on the list. 4 was the Internet of Things, which was 8, and that included 8 and 10, because of the security aspect in. I actually think number 10 in this cybersecurity, including Paris Call, was in a number of different places, as you said. And then I had 12 and 13, which was ensuring inclusion in digital transformation and incorporating the SDGs there as well. So I saw just those 5.
And you missed AI, changes and challenges to data governance, which is 6.
Okay, AI and just 6.
Yeah, maybe others are captured as well, but I mean, in my counting, that was 6.
So that's a proposal. I'll let people think through that. I think that's actually pretty close where I was as well. I had one, the one that Danielle is calling kind of human rights respecting in a world of quick action. I think some of the conversation said it's kind of an internet of trust and that sort of thing, and maybe it's 1, 10, 14, and 9, but basically the same large subset of workshops. I think that was one kind of aggregation that was emerging from the discussion in the room. The policy making in a digital world, I think that's actually a nice way to capture some of the proposals that are there. I did actually have digital governance and digital trade as another area. There was some support for combining AI and and incorporating some of the other kind of data elements and that sort of thing. And the same thing for IoT, and the same thing for 12 and 13 that you were. So I think in terms of the conversation I was trying to capture from the room, I don't think we're all that far apart. I want to come to Changatai to see if he has any kind of general observations, then let everybody think through that and figure out what we do next in the process. We can clearly put together quickly a couple of kind of spreadsheets that consolidate these a little bit differently, or we go away with small groups of people to try and maybe it's just we split into kind of 2 groups and each one of them gets 3 or 4 buckets to try and think through a little bit. I think at some point we can let this specific list and titles go, and we need to go to the next level of depth in the discussion and really figure out what we mean and what some of the key focus points would be. But let me go to Changatai, and then we'll come to you, Ben. Changatai.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I think most of what I'll say has been said. I did make a comment earlier to Lynn at the beginning, and it was basically in line with what Paul said. We shouldn't forget that this year we are trying to focus the IGF meeting a little bit more and streamline it. So really shouldn't be having competing workshops or sessions. We have the 3 thematic streams, and those are already split into 2. If we have another main session that competes with one of those, then of course we are sort of taking a little bit of a step backwards, and people's attention will be divided into which of these will come, and those and that session or stream will suffer when that main session is there as well. So we should take that into consideration. And there's room for merging in this list. I mean, there's a lot of room, and also with my observation, yes, with the IGF, we should concentrate on the issues, and we can have specific illustrative examples, which is, very welcome, instead of the other way around, if you know what I mean. So I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on a specific event or area, but the thing that comes first is the issue, and then we can have the illustrative examples of what happened then and how to react. I hope that comes clear through. And yes, and for the main sessions, it may be good to look and see what gaps should we fill, and use those sessions to fill those gaps. And also, I'll make a little break there, and I'll also do a little bit of a push for the session, for the thematic session, for the frontier issues session as well. I mean, I think we do have to show that we are responding to what has been said by the Secretary General. So I'll do a little push for that. Thanks.
I think those were all very good points, Chengetai. Ben, you have the floor.
That's the same old hand. On my screen it says, I have no floor request. I will put my hand down. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that. So then let me, there's two possible threads of the conversation here. One is kind of purpose of main sessions and role and how many, and ensure they're adding to the program, not taking away or kind of diffusing the increased focus. Another possible thread is kind of exploring in a little more depth some small number of emerging potential topics for workshops along the proposal Daniela put out. I said I could certainly go with that. I think it's very similar to what I was capturing from the discussion in the room, which I think is where hers was coming from as well. But let me see if there are any kind of general comments or observations first. Daniela.
Thank you. Maybe just one clarification. Number 5, in my view, that's clear that we will have that. That's why I didn't include that in my list, right? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Ben, are you signaling or with your mic lit?
Yes, I actually do mean to put my hand up now. It was a question really about, and I really appreciate that you and Daniela are kind of have grouped these as we go along and provide a basis for looking at these as a next step now. And it was, I think the second grouping was 2, 7, 9, and 11. And the first grouping was 1, 4, and 14. Sorry, just to be throwing numbers. So 1 and 14 are both related to the Christchurch call. And 9, which you've put separately, talks about the Paris call and the Christchurch call. And I think a lot of us have talked about looking at those as two examples that could be put together alongside a broader discussion. So I was wondering why, I was questioning the wisdom of separating 9 from 1 and putting 9 and 1 in different places. I'd have thought it's 1, 4, 9, and 14 in the first basket, rather than putting 9 with 2, 7, and 11. I'm getting a bit lost with the numbers myself, but that was the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think about putting just I don't even want to say a placeholder title, but just something so we know what we're all talking about on these groupings. I mean, in fact, what we think might have been included in 9 could be in the human rights respecting or the policy. It could be in both. And if we went away and developed those, we would try and take whatever kind of concepts or notions we thought were embedded in 9 and bring those elements into any other consolidated proposal, whether it was the human rights respecting or what some people were calling earlier with 114 and 9 kind of an Internet of Trust focus, or in the policy making in today's digital world. I mean, I don't think we need to be kind of pure about putting them in one or the other. I think it's more important that we use these titles to grab the notions of what we wanted to talk about, figure out what kind of aggregated grouping is, and then continue to flesh that out or dive down from there. Again, all this is assuming when we get to the end of this process, we think this is an important topic, a relevant topic, different enough from what else is in the program, and one that does actually deserve to be at a main session level. So Yuta, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I just wanted to support what Ben said just before. I do think that 1 and 9 belong together, and I have a bit of concerns that with the combination that was suggested, that we reduce human rights to only the issue of misinformation, fake news, like bringing that together with 14 and with 1. I do think that human rights still is a broader issue, and it needs to be underlined that with everything that is going on in the area of digitization, human rights can be infringed, not only by misinformation and by hate speech and that. So I do think it's a broader theme, and probably it deserves to be dealt with in a main session that is overarching.
Okay, good, that's what I was going to ask. So your proposal would be that there was a main session that was really focused on human rights, and I think if you could kind of add a couple of sentences that said what would the session be. I was going to ask, when you first started speaking, whether or not you thought human rights just should be much more preeminent in many of the sessions, or if it was for a separate session.
Yes, that's the difficulty of the hen and the egg. So once we know what is in the other sessions, we will see whether it's overlapping, and then that should not be the case, or whether it's something overarching, which is different to overlapping. My only concern is that we should not have a session that reduces human rights to the issue of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, that we address also the other issues in the same men's session on human rights. And looking at 1 and 14, these are 2 strong topics, and that's my concern, that among these 2 strong topics, human rights as a broader theme could be a little bit submerged and needs more attention.
No, and I mean, as I said earlier, I think we ought to be elevating human rights concerns in every one of our discussions, particularly today. So I think that's something we should all keep in mind as we go through this, and rights respecting and elevating that, and that discussion. What I might encourage you to do is just separately think about if you were to put together a session that was focused on human rights, what would the specific focus of it be, and not try to wait and see whether or not we think it's adequately covered in all of the others. Thank you, Yuta. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Maria Paz from the Civil Society. Just want to second what Yuta just mentioned. I think that it's relevant to do both things, like to keep the relevance of a human rights discussion by keeping this space for identifying things that will not be covered in the other session, but also linked to my previous comment, it's important to keep in mind that in each one of the other topics, we should be addressing the human rights consideration, as you mentioned. And I also want to agree with what Ben said before regarding that there should be separation between number 1, 14, and 9. So I think at least these 3 proposals should end in 2 different buckets. I will reiterate my opinion that I raised previously, that the way in which I see that is more logical to do that is by separate the general conversation about content governance, moderation, whatever we want to call it, and the specific issue of emergency situation. I think that's more useful framework that keep referring to a specific initiative because of this risk of exclusion that my colleagues have raised before. I think that would be the better way to make it enough broad for everyone feel part of the conversation, but enough focused so we don't merge two topics that have slightly different favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Then can I ask you to do the same thing we just asked Yuta, which is, can you put a couple of sentences down that talk about what you think content governance or would, and I would encourage everybody to do the same thing we asked all the workshop submitters to do, is to really dial in on what you think the policy question is you're addressing. What do you want to achieve with the session? What specifically are you trying to advance? I think that would help determine whether or not it was a substantive enough topic and a substantive enough question. Ananda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. I think I was not there when this proposal were discussed. I believe we should have at least three main sessions on the themes that were decided on data governance, digital inclusion, security, safety, stability, and resilience. So that compose 3 sessions. And to capture the global trends on how ICT policies, legal and regulatory frameworks are drafted and practiced, and what is their implications for internet governance, we should have a very comprehensive session on ICT global trends and ICT policies, legal and regulatory frameworks, and their implications on internet governance. Fifth session could be on emerging technology trends and their implications for internet governance. So that includes a lot of related technologies, could be IoT, AI, and machine learning, and so many other things. Sixth session could be on internet governance in the light of democracy, freedom of expression online, hate speech, fake news, content regulation, privacy, and so many things that are more on the soft side. And finally, because everything we are doing for the good, and then one session on how internet governance is important for addressing 2030 development agenda, that is sustainable development goals. So if we have this 3 + 4 is 7 sessions, I think that will capture. Now the problem is mapping all those 17 proposals onto these 7 themes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ananda. Yeah, I mean, I did try and capture what you said, and Daniela just asked you to repeat it as well. And so let me just give you a moment to do that. I think we need to there's nothing that says we need to find a home for all 15 of those at all. And actually, there's really only sort of the top 14, because the 15th was more of a kind of a process question that I thought was open. And I also think we don't need to think that if we want to keep a particular proposal there, that we can only assign it to one of these other major buckets, because there are components in them that clearly, as we've all said so many times, could fit almost anywhere. So I don't want us to be too focused on either finding a singular home for each one of them, nor finding a home for all of them. And I think if we could get maybe at the next step to, maybe we need a high-level view of kind of the titles, and then a quick which ones would fit under that, and then we could go away from there. And I think you gave a couple of new aggregations in titles that I'd just like to hear again, if you don't mind going through it again.
My proposal is 3 sessions on the 3 priority themes that we already identified: data governance, digital inclusion, and the third, security, safety, stability, and resilience.
Okay, and Ananda, just so we can try and close on that. And I think everybody, there's strong support that what we have in the main session should actually look like the overall themes. I think we were pretty close to agreeing that, and Daniela said in her comments, other people said it around the room, that with a lot of the high-level titles we're associating with, that there is resonance and linkages to the current theme. So I think that's a given, and we should keep that in mind, and we go through the shorter list, make sure that we can identify them up. But I think there's one. I'm trying to close some questions to make sure those that I think are closed already are really closed, and we can just keep keep building forward.
Because we have received a sizable amount of proposals on these three themes, we can also highlight what are the issues that people want to see in those themes. So that will make a good session for each of our themes. The fourth session is on global trends on ICT policy, legal and regulatory frameworks. Global trends on ICT policy, legal and regulatory frameworks and their implications for internet governance. Because I realized, having working with the ITU for a long time, the internet governance and the ITU activities on the ICTs are not very much aligned. People in the internet governance don't really take into consideration the massive work ITU has done on the related issues. I don't see any of the proposals talking about works done by ITU, especially in my security, safety, stability and resilience. 86 proposal, none of them mentioned ITU. ITU started this global cybersecurity agenda back in 2008, and they produce every year global cybersecurity index, measuring the 5 components, how countries stand, with lot of indicators. So, but the IG community, they don't refer to any of the work of ITU. We talk so much about Paris Call, but we have not talked about other things that are similarly done elsewhere. So, I think we require a comprehensive view on the global trends, how ICT policy, legal and regulatory frameworks are being practiced, and their implications for internet governance. And the fifth session is on internet governance in the light of democracy, because it's much talk that the liberal democracy's future being questioned by the emergence of technologies like artificial intelligence, how people's mind can be maneuvered by technologies like that. So I think in the light of democracy, freedom of expression online, hate speech, fake news, content regulation, privacy, whatever topics are soft and politically inclined. So this we can have one session. And the final session, that is 7th, is on how IG is important, internet governance is important for addressing 2030 development agenda, the sustainable development goals. So that makes up 7 sessions that I proposed.
Okay, I had noted before that I thought your 6 was emerging technologies and trends.
Right, yeah, emerging technology trends and their implications for internet governance. There we can talk about artificial intelligence, IoT, machine learning, big data, data analytics, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ananda. Jutta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn, for giving me the floor. I just wanted to make a practical suggestion. I do think that the grouping that Daniela did before was very useful to get an overview on how these suggestions could be grouped. And I also heard some very convincing titles that Ananda now has phrased. So if we could get that as an overview, we are now looking on the list of the 17, but we probably need to have a look on that grouping. I wasn't quick enough to write that all down, what Daniela said, how the different suggestions could be grouped, and then also having these proposed titles from Ananda, and then we might be able to bring it together, both thoughts.
Agree, that's a good suggestion. We'll come to Paul, and then I think it would be helpful if, I think we need to leave the list up there so we all know what we're referring to when we say 9, 4, and 14. But maybe we could ask Eleanor to start a Google Doc which would actually just kind of capture, maybe a draft title or two, these proposals that would fit under that, and then we can send that out to everybody's mailbox, see if that works. And appreciate all the pragmatic suggestions for how to process through this. So anybody that has any more, please jump in. Paul Rowney, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, not wanting to sound controversial, but I see only 3 main sessions.
Every time you take the floor, there's one less.
I see one that deals with the cross-cutting issues. I see one that is the high-level panel and frontier issues, which can include the emerging issues, and one on the major policy issues. So from my perspective, I think we can consolidate all of this into 3 main sessions and allow the participants to focus more on the workshops and the IGF in general. If we consolidate down to 3, I don't think there's really a pressing need for the NRIs to have their own main session, or the DCs.
With some respect, I'm not going to open up that conversation again. I think we need to recognize here that the NRIs are autonomous entities, and we're trying to find a way that we can kind of get a good neighborhood going here, where we can actually kind of share some space that supports their needs, very clearly stated needs that support them and their activities as they go back home and this room. It's a 2-hour slot we're giving them to advance theirs. To be really clear, I don't actually feel it's the MAG's decision to absolutely say yes or no to them. I mean, in one level, they're very clearly an autonomous set of activities who want to integrate and work closely with the IGF. The MAG could declare they don't want the NRIs there. I think that would be, frankly, I think that would be a terrible, terrible mistake.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying though is changing the focus of the main sessions, which may change people's thought processes of why they want to have a main session, which might negate that conversation. Anyway, I'm just putting it out there.
No, and I appreciate that. And maybe we can come back later on and have another round of making sure what's in front of the MAG is what the NRIs are currently thinking there. It's clear that they want to work with the MAG and integrate the MAG and ensure that their activities support the overall program, which was built by the community in terms of the call for issues and then the subsequent themes. So there ought to be, at a natural level, good alignment there. And the same thing with the DCs as well. So, we can come back and figure out what we need to do to ensure that there's good alignment between kind of programs and initiatives and supporting actors. But I really want people to think kind of carefully and respect which is why we went to that program component document 3 years ago, was to make clear that the MAG understood sort of what the kind of guiding documents and the linkages were between all the component pieces of the IGF ecosystem and the MAG. And I'll also, point out that, of course, the MAG is to advise the Secretary General on the annual meeting program of the IGF, and it's very clear, frankly, in everything we all do, but very clear within the UN system as well, that supporting local, national, and regional efforts at the local, national, and regional level is critically important, and obviously meets all sorts of goals with respect to inclusion and that sort of thing. So I think we need to pay careful attention to what they say is not just helpful, but really essential to their own good, solid activities at, again, local, national, and regional levels. So let me let you finish your comments, Paul, because I think I may have interrupted you there. And then we'll go to Carlos after. So Paul,
No, I finished. I'm just throwing a different train of thought into the air.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you. I really liked Ananda's speech, and I think that every effort by larger organizations to frame, understand better, quantify, qualify the efforts regarding cybersecurity and safety, etc., are very relevant. I too should certainly be present here somehow to expose that effort. Now, I think, taking advantage of the mentioning of ITU, that the future of ITU is in managing and governing the spectrum. That's clear. And it would be great if the ITU proposed a session or something which would show us their efforts to democratize the spectrum, to make sure that the community can use the spectrum and it is not only hoarded by the large corporations, telecommunications corporations. And what are the efforts that ITU is doing in terms of its proposals, its regulations, etc., and harmonization efforts to make sure that the community can use the spectrum and provide universal access at the local level in a very significant manner in order to enhance digital inclusion.
Thank you, Carlos. Those are very helpful points as well. Chengetai is trying to see if, in fact, the ITU has an open forum, because I would say there are lots of organizations similar to the ITU that we engage in and involve in deeply that have just as much relevance to the things we're doing in IGF as others. We could argue kind of WIPO, UNCTAD, OECD, UNESCO, all of those organizations have, very substantive interlinkages, and we need to make sure we're interfacing and working with all of them appropriately. And in fact, the open forums were created specifically to give them space to come in and talk about their activities as it links with the kind of questions and concerns and interests of the internet governance community. So we'll come back when we understand who's on the open forum list or not.
They did say that they did submit an open forum. I'm just having trouble locating it, but they did submit it. And as Lynn said, yes, I mean, UNESCO is there as well, and almost all the organizations that have, UNICEF as well, etc. Yeah.
Carlos's point was, of course, a little bit different than Ananda's, and it would be interesting, actually, to go to the open forum and ask some of those questions as well. Benny?
Just to comment on Carlos' point, ITU actually also does the WSIS forums every year. So many of the topics that they would cover at an IGF, they actually have the opportunity to do in an environment which is also open and like multi-stakeholder with participation of some of the people who actually are in the room as well.
No, that's a good point too. So let me, Paul kind of has made the comment several times that we ought to have fewer main sessions than what we're sort of currently anticipating and have historically had. I'd like to open up the floor for kind of comments on that. Comments, observations? So any strong feeling one way or the other? Maria?
Yes, Maria Paz Canales from Civil Society, for the record. I think that one good thing that Paul tried to raise it and maybe got lost in the criticism of like narrowing down too much is that there is like a power of signalizing what is really like the main when you have few of the main. So I think that it's valuable in that sense because we are like really giving the main session a place that is clearly differentiated from the other workshop sessions. So I would say that it's not something bad to have few of them. I think that it's good in terms of like how we want to really give this discussion an important and differentiated place among all what will be happening during the IGF. That's my opinion. Thank you.
And I mean, I think that's a very good point that Paul made, and thank you for calling us back to that as well. And Paul knows, I think, that I certainly very much appreciate all of his kind of creative thinking and opening up the discussions here too. So really interested in other MAG members' comments or reflections. Giacomo?
Just to complement what was said by Carlos, the ITU will have its 2 years conference on biannual conference on spectrum, exactly between October and November. They will finish on the 10th of November. And there will be conclusion of that conference that will be available. So eventually this can be something that if we want to have a report and to be discussed, probably can be inserted in the open forum that they have. This is a message that can be passed to them easily, I think.
No, thank you, Giacomo. Not getting any kind of traction on the other question, let me propose something, I think building on Yuta's contribution here, is we can, all of us working from the list we put together, try and put some high-level titles to a few sessions, identify the numbers that fit under them from this list that's in front of us, see what kind of profile that gives us, and then we can either split into a couple of breakout groups to see if we can kind of come up with a key policy question or something that we believe would signal kind of the main intent of the session, the main value of the session, and then later in the afternoon come back and look at that and use that to determine. Again, I think there's two things to consider on the number of sessions. We should only put sessions up as main sessions if they truly are substantive, adding value, bringing in significant speakers, new viewpoints, significantly add a different value than a normal workshop. I think the other consideration is the one that Paul and Maria have stated, which is what we do in the main sessions does signal both the importance of the main sessions, but it also kind of signals in maybe a reverse way kind of the importance of the rest of the program as well. So I think that's a consideration to take into account when we think about how many. Is that a path we could kind of go forward here, or is there any other quick suggestion? So let me then try, just in the interest of keep trying to move things forward. Let me at least start along the path that I think Yuta was suggesting, and I think the room was kind of merging towards, and see what that actually tells us. And if I could ask Eleanor to try and capture that so we can see it later on in a Google Doc or Word table or something, that would be helpful. There was something which the various parts of the community had kind of labeled kind of an internet of trust, or a human rights respecting in a world which requires quick policy action. Those were the two titles, and the workshops that were, the topics that were underneath that variously were 1, 4, 9, and 14. Susan?
Thanks, Chair. I think that title might run the risk of conflating the content governance issues with the cybersecurity issues. I think those two should be kept separate because they're pretty big. So I also wonder if focusing the discussion on reaction times might necessarily limit a more comprehensive discussion on content governance. Like if we're just talking about timeframes, I think that's certainly an element, like the ability to be able to react quickly in this world. I think that's certainly an element that needs to be incorporated into the discussion. I would caution against focusing that in the title.
Okay, so that's good. So let's maybe, let's kick around what the title ought to be, because I actually do agree with the quick action. I may also agree with leading with human rights respecting, when I think much of what everybody in that I don't know is appropriate, and that really what people are talking about is kind of content and governance policy models done well or something, I think. But is there anybody here who can actually suggest kind of a high-level title that captures the discussion we've been having around those series of issues? Anyone? Maria?
I think I also already did, but I can restate. If we are like talking here about this emergency quick response issue, I would say dealing with contact in an emergency situation with a human rights perspective. If we are talking about only the issue of contact, which Susan was trying to clarify, that it would be good to separate from other things.
Totally agree with what you just said. Just trying to process our way through it. Susan?
So human rights and content governance would be one idea.
Yeah, but in that case, that comes back to the idea that there are two different things. One, if we want to talk like broadly about any kind of content governance, and another thing related with the quick emergency situation. It's my view that I have been trying to reiterate every time in the conversation, but still think that it's a valuable point. If you consider that it's not, I'm going to shut up. This is the last time that I mention it. Thank you.
So is the higher level one really about, and I don't even know if it's human rights and governments, but it's about content and governance policy models done well, and it's open and exclusive and it's multi-stakeholder and it's with those that need to participate in the discussion and whether it's done quickly or not. I mean, just because it needs to be done quickly doesn't mean it should be done differently or badly. So maybe we can, and I think that's where, in that grouping was where the Christchurch call, the Paris call, where the other components were, there were kind of examples of processes that.
Sure, it's one specific inside that. The only thing that I want to try to highlight that originally the proposal that sparked this conversation was devoted more to that type of situation. It's a strategic decision that we can make as a MAG to say that we want to put all in the same bucket because as substance, they belong to the same. But one is a specification of the other.
So maybe I could ask, so one is content governance policy, how to do it well is one. We know what Maria, I could bring us back to, is there was kind of a text or subtopic in there, which is because of some specific examples, do we want to focus on those, whether it's because they were, did they need to be done quickly? And in this case, they were not done particularly well in our view. So, I mean, how prominent a role does that play? I'll give the floor to Danielle, but then maybe also to Sylvia, since it was Sylvia and a few other people and maybe Ben, since you were involved in some of the Paris call. But Daniela.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I see the point that if we have the time issue in the headline, then that changes the subject. But in fact, I think there is a good reason to do that, because time is a critical issue here. When we are talking about, for example, terrorist content on the internet, then the question is how fast can we take it down, and how fast should we, and how fast should we react? And reaction times are getting, let's say, I mean, the dynamic on the internet is getting quicker and quicker, and the question is how should democracies and enterprises and the civil society react to that? And that's why I would advocate still to focus also maybe in one session and having others, okay, but focusing on that issue is, I think, adequate. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniela. Jutta, you have the floor. I think, Giacomo, you're an old hand, if I'm... Jutta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn, for giving me the floor. When you phrased content governance, how to do it well, I do think that is very much related to something else that Ananda phrased, the developments in regard to democracy. So, I do think relating it to democracy is a bit broader, but it would help us to cover it in a broader way. So I do think this relation to democracy, I don't have the phrasing that Ananda used, but I do think that was very helpful.
Thank you, Jutta. I'm trying to see if I've got it in my notes here too. Raquel?
Thank you, Lynn. I would like to make a suggestion perhaps on one theme or title, challenges for quick policy reactions regarding online content. I would like to highlight here, when we talk about challenges, we are talking about the why, the good and the bad, and this discussion, the quick reaction, the policy reaction, and online content. We are talking about content governance, but I think we need to highlight it's online content governance, and we are not confusing the communication means that we want to go through here. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think that's an interesting title as well, and I thought when the proposal came forward, I mean, if something needs to be taken down because it's extremist and it needs to be taken down quickly every time, I think, you know, but what's the right way to determine who should do that, on what basis, and what's appropriate? That is, I think, a more thoughtful process that we would argue needs to be much more open and inclusive, which I thought was more the thread of the proposal, you know, that Sylvia had brought in yesterday. So it's not, how do we do, you know, takedowns quickly in somebody's mind, or because somebody has that's a different proposal, and honestly, I'm not sure that kind of rises to a high level main session. But let me keep going through Ben and then Veni and see if we can at least capture this well enough with the 4 titles underneath it, so we can try and go to the next one. Ben?
Thank you, Lynn. I don't have a particular problem with content governance, and I think there's ways it can be made broad enough to capture the ideas that Sylvia and Maria have both brought. Just note that the Paris call was about the security of networks, not about the content that goes over it. So very happy to have a content session which captures a Christchurch call. Just to note, that wouldn't cover the Paris call. We'd either take the Paris call somewhere else, or we wouldn't have it in a main session, but it wouldn't be part of this. Thank you.
No, I think that's an important point as well, since of course Maria's giving 2 thumbs up. Since of course security is a critical topic and obviously one of our main themes. Who's Veni? Veni, you have.
Thank you. Just sharing some personal information from last year's work of the high-level expert group on fake news and disinformation online to the European Commission, in which I participated. The question about taking content down quickly was discussed in a number of, you know, sessions that we had, and perhaps this, I mean, there are a lot of workshops that are dealing with fake news, and perhaps that's one of the ways where you can get, or whoever is organizing, you know, the sessions can invite somebody from that group to explain the rationale and what was the intention behind also calls of the European Commission after we published our report last April, I think, or March, to see what happened and what's the current status and what are the online platforms doing, etc., etc. So that's a fascinating topic, but I'm not sure under which of those session topics it will fall.
That's a good suggestion with respect to following up on the other sessions. What if we, for this bucket, I almost feel like the conversation is now split into 2. One of them is kind of content, online platforms. What does a good policy model look like? The timing piece comes in, I think, in the fact that clearly what nation states do, they need to be able to have, and private sector to react quickly. I don't think it means that, but I think the policy for determining when that's done, how it's done, who does it, under what circumstance, who's notified, that's the piece that needs the thoughtful process. And then the other quick kind of takedowns happen. But that's different from, as Ben was just pointing out, kind of what was the intent behind some of these other security pieces. We could, for right now, maybe just say, without putting a title on it, but say this one session, which would incorporate pieces from 1, 4, 9, and 14, would look at challenges for good policy making in the content online platform world, something like that. That's really kind of clumsy, but again, it's not a title we want. I just want to make sure we're pulling the appropriate pieces in. And the term Ananda had used earlier was internet governance in light of democracy, which is, I think, some of the rights respecting pieces as well, which of course we'd want to make sure that any of those developing policy processes were rights respecting and multi-stakeholder and that sort of thing. You know, is there and if we put those like buckets together and a group went away, would a group be able to go away and say, here's the policy question I think we'd like to address, here's the specific topic we'd like to advance? Could they use that to narrow down on one that focused on that component rather than kind of the Christchurch, the security, cybersecurity Paris call components, which might be a separate? Does that work for anybody? Does that not work for everybody? I mean, I think all we're trying to do here is identify some small number of groupings. It's probably in the neighborhood of 6 or 7, just in terms of kind of manageability, that we can go away and in some smaller groups, you know, spend a half hour, an hour brainstorming a little bit so we understand whether or not there's something substantive enough there to go away and further develop with the main session in mind. And all we need to do is to find enough way to put the right, it's almost like put the tags in a bucket and with this kind of discussion as the background context. And let me try a different one then, see, we'll come back to that one in a moment. If we wanted to say digital governance and digital trade, which was number one, the third one up there. Is that something that people understand enough what's kind of embedded in there and would support that being a possible main session that we would ask some people to go away and spend some time outlining kind of either the policy question or a paragraph that would support it? I'm trying to figure out if it's the process which isn't working or if it was the first one was just so complex with all the different pieces and the threads. Raquel?
Okay, thank you. Lynn, I think it moved fast for the third one. So can you go back and restate what was the first option? Okay.
Yes, I'm trying to, I'm obviously trying to figure out a process going forward here. And so I chose a kind of a single issue which said, if we said we wanted a working group to go away and look at session topic number 3 here, digital governance and digital trade, does this room feel that a group of people could go away, look at digital governance, digital trade, and come up with a paragraph or 2 description or policy question or 2 that they think would say, this is what we think we would do with a main session on digital governance and digital trade? Because if the answer to that is no, then we'd want to know whether people didn't agree with the topic or it's the process, or what I was trying to separate out is the first one is pretty complex because of all the different threads. So I was trying to go to something that was more kind of a single focus and use that to advance the process, if you will. So Dennis has asked for the floor, and then Ben, unless you wanted to come back in, Raquel.
I actually wanted to ask a question about digital governance and digital trade. One of our work in the UN is on digital government. We produce UN e-government survey every other year, and I cannot understand digital governance and digital trade and what actually we mean with digital governance in this context. If we talk about digital economy, for example, that's another area maybe clearer to people, but digital governance and digital trade, how do they go together?
Do you want to comment on that, Daniela, since I think it was your suggestion yesterday?
Well, first of all, I would volunteer, probably with Rudolf and hopefully with others, to go into that subject in more detail. Our idea behind that was that, in fact, there is an interlinkage between digital issues, and that's maybe digital governance is then not the right term, but what we meant is cybersecurity, for example, also free flow of data issues and trade issues are interlinked, and that's what shall be dealt with in that session. That was the main idea, and to cover the different subjects of digital policy that I think it was Kenta who already mentioned that is already covered inside the digital governance track among G20 that should be incorporated, also having in mind when writing down the concrete issues of that topic. And maybe that was a little bit short than just putting all that under the headline of digital governance, but that was the idea behind. And Rudolf just told me that there's already lunch downstairs, so in case you would like to have the break now instead of in half an hour, that would be possible.
Thank you. I think we probably need to figure out what we're going to do with this process this afternoon before we break, or if we'll lose the afternoon to continued process discussion. Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you, and it was in response to your question about the digital trade and digital governance, and Daniela's additional comments there. It feels like it's the only one of the 17 that's clearly related to the data governance theme. That's how I read it. It was about the free flow of data and the challenges around that, and different approaches to digital trade and different views around that. It's one of the topics. I think one of 20 workshops looks, no, a couple, 2 of them look at that issue. So it's partly covered within the data governance theme. It's relevant to the data governance theme. It would provide a main session linked to one of the 3 themes. But obviously there would be challenges of doing it in such a way that was broader and distinct from the workshop discussion. Thank you.
We'll go to Helani and then come back and see if this little tact work. Helani?
Thank you, Lynn. Just thinking if there's scope for this digital governance track that we're talking about to think of itself as an overarching panel on digital economy issues with a particular focus on governance of trade and the governance of labor or employment. So it's really about trade if you think about employment, digital employment as one mode of trade, right? Where people are not co-present. Because there are a couple of workshops that came on the issue of employment, labor, good work, etc. Then the trade issues, and all of these are about cross-border issues. So we could pick up the economic angles possibly in this. And because I feel like the security, if we bring into this the cross-border data angles of purely data security, that would possibly be well covered in another panel, and keep this to more digital economy stuff. Just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Helani. Very helpful. And I think, one of the things you point out is, obviously, as discussions progress, we would want to go back and look at the workshops that have been selected and understand what's being covered within them to make sure that this is complementing, obviously not redundant, and also look at a lot of the intersessional activities as well. So dynamic coalitions, are there other activities happening in the NRIs and things? So I think maybe the right way to proceed through this is we have these 6 kind of major buckets. And the discussion we were just trying to have a moment ago about the first bucket, which was 1, 4, 9, and 14, whether or not it's a focus on content or it's a focus on, you know, how do we do speedy regulation fast, whether or not it incorporated, you know, kind of the Paris call sort of components or not. Those are questions maybe that are left for a smaller working group to really sit down and take an hour and try and work through. So one proposal is that we would actually take the 6 working working groups that we were talking about earlier, we captured earlier, and break out, sit down, and take the next stab at, is there something substantive here? Do we think we can put some policy questions or a topic that we think would be of significant interest and rise to the level of a main session? And if we did that, we've got that organized before lunch, and maybe from 3 to 4, or if people wanted to start earlier, they start earlier and come back, and at 4 o'clock we come back and try and walk through these 6. Is that a possible approach? I don't know if we're going to make a lot of progress here trying to go through each one of these with everybody in the room. So everybody's thinking that through. Let me just kind of remind everybody, if you can't see quickly, and we can send the chart out to you. The first one, what Eleanor has done is combined, she's left the topic numbers the same, but moved them up and color-coded them to the big groupings which are there on the right, which is extraordinarily helpful. So whatever the possible title is, human rights respecting in a world of ever quicker action, internet governance in light of democracy, or challenges for good policy making in the content online platform world, all those and other variants were suggested as possible titles. They all had referenced parts of 1, 4, 9, or 14 in their grouping. That was one. The second one was grouping 2, 7, 9, and 11. And again, that was also kind of policy making in the digital world, different approaches to internet governance, from the Paris call, you know, et cetera. You go over the Christchurch call to the Berlin meeting. The third one was a suggestion that digital governance, digital trade, and maybe the cross-cutting issue of jurisdiction would be captured as another bucket. Trying to focus a little less on the title. The other one was the cross-cutting issue of AI. I frankly would probably even take 15 out of there, because 15 wasn't a proposal per se. It was me actually trying to capture the fact that there was a request that we kind of start with our process that had the call for issues, the major themes, the approved workshops, the policy questions embedded in those workshops, and whether or not that ought to lead us towards having a main session, having followed that train of thought. A parallel idea was there, of course, that we ought to have main sessions tied specifically to the 3 main tracks. I think there was, you know, a fair amount of support in the room for saying that with the main buckets we have identified here, we think we have enough that would tie to the safety, security, stability, and resilience, another one that would tie to digital inclusion, another one that would tie to data governance, unless we think we want a more specific stream built up from that. But then I would suggest that we probably have the topping sessions that we could actually use to do that without having yet had the topping discussion fully. And then there was the cross-cutting issue of IoT and a notion that sort of cybersecurity fit in there. I mean, again, I think cybersecurity is a little bit like human rights. It's in a number of places. I think the issue really is whether or not we think we need a significant separate focus on that. And then we had the ensuring inclusion, digital transformation, and the SDG kind of component. So those are the sort of 6 main things that I think Daniela had come up as far as your construct. It actually matches pretty much was mine as well. And again, the other one that we're actually missing is the HLPDC frontier issues one. Right. Let me see it there. Yeah, so there would be another one, which was the HLPDC. I think Ben and Halani are old hands, so I'll go to Yuta, because I never saw them go down. So Yuta.
Thank you, Lynn, for giving me the floor. I also wanted to mention that we had left out the HLPDC. That was the first point. And the second point is that looking at the possible titles, I do think that the first group and the second group are too close to each other. Both are dealing with policy making in the digital world, and we need to differentiate. It's just too close, and if we go now away in smaller groups and one is dealing with the one and the other, that's not separate enough. We need to clarify which one of these first 2 mentioned is dealing with policy making and which one is dedicated to the other issues that are left then.
Thank you, Yuta. I think that's a good observation. One thing we could do would be to ask one breakout group to look at those 2 and clearly drive a distinction between them, which is probably the clearest way to do that. And maybe we have a third working group which might focus on the digital governance and digital trade. Another one that might focus on the artificial intelligence, Internet of Things buckets, given some of the comments that were made earlier as well. And then I think the ensuring inclusion is probably a 4th one. Would that be a way to proceed? Do people want to split up into breakout groups and do that? I mean, again, we always have the time pressure. We basically have about 3 hours of group working time left together. And this kind of conversation you cannot do over an email list. And we can't do it in two-hour calls every other 2 weeks either. So we need to find a way to make substantive enough progress that we can go away and do the work offline and virtually. So looking for specific comments, I'll kind of bend a minute, which is, could we get 4 breakout groups along the lines that I've actually just said? And maybe Eleanor could quickly kind of color code in a different color. The human rights respecting policy making is one group. AI and IoT as another group. And that would leave digital governance, digital trade as one, and ensuring inclusion as a 4th one. Ben, you have the floor.
So in response to Yuta's comments, I think that the top grouping, it's around content. And the second grouping is around internet governance, policy making generally, the kind of issues the high-level panel was driving at, and multidisciplinary approaches. So something needs to be done with the titles, but I think there's a clear distinction. And then secondly, I fully support the idea of us working. I think we can break a little early for lunch and we can come back at 2:30 and work for an hour in groups. So thank you for suggesting that process, and I'm happy to do that.
Okay, and I do like your comments. So maybe what we do in the first bucket on possible titles is make it clear that that's a content focus. And what one word would you put to the second bucket? Words?
Multidisciplinary. It kind of captures the high-level panel. It captures multidisciplinary internet governance, if you want 3 words. But yeah, it's about policy approaches generally rather than a policy
Okay,
issue.
so say policy, some policy making or policy approaches maybe. So it doesn't feel like it's so centric to those that make it. Okay, and then we have digital governance and digital trade as a third bucket. How do people feel about connecting the AI and the IoT buckets, or are those two separate buckets?
Lynn, if I may.
Raquel?
Yeah. I would suggest, I also support your approach to break earlier and come back and use our face-to-face time to get it done. I would suggest perhaps 2 breakout groups. I think the 3 ones are very connected, and perhaps we can move quickly into making the distinctions between jurisdiction, the content approach, and the policy approaches. And then the second one is, well, digital transformation in general, and then AI, IoT, and there are distinctions in there, but I think within the group, those are the 2 big breaks.
Okay, now that, I mean, that's a good point as well, because if we read the AI bucket says chances and challenges to data governance, and the IoT is the interconnection of everything, how to guarantee security. So you would leave that as 2 breakout groups, is what you said, right? And then we've got the ensuring inclusion with the SDG component. I don't think we need a breakout group on the HLPDC frontier issues now. I think we wait until we see the report, get our own community consultation going, and figure that out later. So that would mean 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no, 6. 6 breakout groups. And I think, you know, we have this room here, we could come back and huddle. We could probably, you know, get Secretariat to flip over the place cards and ask these different groups to huddle at various parts of the room so you know where you're going. I mean, I would ask people to make sure that we do try and kind of staff all of them to some extent. And if we did come back and meet at 2:30, I mean, even earlier than that if people want a shorter lunch break, come back and maybe plan like 3:30 to convene again as a, and I would actually like to suggest that, you know, there are other people in the room that aren't MAG members. They've been here all day, several days. Personally, I always like to err on the side of being really inclusive. I would say that if they want to participate in some of these working groups and bring their expertise and experience, we can frankly use the bodies and all the help we can get at this point, clearly recognizing that as we go forward, it's obviously a MAG decision. But is there any objection to inviting those people that are here in the room to participate in the working groups? No? Everybody's supportive of that? Okay. And Halani's saying she's reachable on a WhatsApp call if people have data connectivity. So maybe Halani will just, okay, you want to participate in the digital trade governance group. Okay, so we'll do what we can to facilitate that. Let's, can we send this list out to the MAG so that those MAG members that are participating remotely have it as well, Eleonora? And I don't know if people, if you want to work within these documents in your groups, we can, you know, send you the Google Docs or whatever actually works in terms of capturing ideas. To the extent you could actually capture it in writing, that would certainly help our subsequent activities. One last question, which is how do we actually want to do the group selection? Do we want to just find 6 corners in the room here and we'll ask those MAG members that are participating online if they want to participate in to signal that, and we'll find a way to get you in and WhatsApp or Skype or whatever would work. Do you want to just kind of everybody come back? We can agree a time we all come back and see what kind of distribution we get around the room, or do you want a more formal process right now to figure out who's going to go to what groups? I'm suggesting, I think that we just set up 6 groups with place cards around them. And if people could, everybody just do their best, even if it's not maybe your first group, if you see a group that's not represented, well, go and participate. So are people comfortable? It's about 8 minutes to the hour. What time would people like to kind of reconvene? 2:30? What time? 2:30? 2? So let me just do a quick apologies to those that are online. Show of hands. There's a strong preference online. Please put it in the chat room here as well. But who would want to come back at 2? For those that are on, a small number, like 8, 9 maybe. 2:30? Certainly more for 2:30. So let's come back at 2:30. A little bit of a break is probably a good idea anyway. If everybody could come back at 2:30 in the room, we'll get the WebEx and everything up again for those that want to participate. Maybe if somebody in each one of the groups can keep the WebEx room open, at least there's an easy chat screen there that you can, or you know what, there's lots of tools. Everybody can sort themselves out with respect to what's the right way to participate with anybody who wants to participate online within your working group. Any other advice or?
No, I was saying that one suggestion is that we can make 4 WebEx rooms, and then we'll just put the links into this room once it's done, and then people can break out that way. Well, then we have to use this. Then we have to use appropriate technology. We just have to, because we're in small groups, right? So, yeah, just turn the PC, turn the laptop when people are
People
speaking.
will have to use their smartphones or laptops with the Wi-Fi.
So let me just make sure we're all kind of clear on what it is we're hoping to go and do here. We're going to have the 6 working groups. I think everybody's been set, or will be sent shortly, the spreadsheet that's here. And sincere thanks to Eleanor for capturing it as well. What we'd like to do is everybody spends an hour, so at 3:30 we come back to the big room. If you can have looked, if you can come back with kind of, the most important thing is sort of a paragraph saying what the main session would address. If you can do that concretely by, getting a very specific policy question, that would be great. If you need to, take 2 paragraphs to actually get it kind of bounded for discussion on, that would be good. But the real deliverable is what would this main session address? What would it hope to advance? We need to then, fairly quickly, but I don't think we need to do that today, get to a refined description, policy level question, and a draft title. But we actually have probably a week or 2 to do that. So is everybody clear on what we're asking everybody to do? Because typically you lose 15 minutes, a half hour every time you go back out and come back after lunch and start up again. I think it's pretty simple, just something which really defines what you think this main session would address, would help advance, that would contribute to the IGF discussions. Susan?
Just logistically, would it be possible for somebody to kind of identify the corners where each of the groups should meet, maybe with a piece of paper or something? It just could help.
I know.
Yeah.
On the table or something, but we'll do that. Thank you, everybody. Sincere appreciation for working through this. And hope you have a good lunch. It is downstairs, and we'll see everybody back up here in an hour and a half. Thank you.